on gaining community acceptance.
The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on gaining community acceptance for affordable housing, best practices from around the U.S. My name is Amy Clark, and I'm Director of Marketing and Communications at the National Housing Conference. Joining me on this webinar is Robert Hickey, a Senior Research Associate at NHC's Research Division, the Center for Housing Policy, Nevada Merriman, Senior Project Manager at Mid-Penn Housing Corporation in Foster City, California, and Nicole Macri, Director of Administrative Services at DESC in Seattle. Today's webinar will provide insight into the key themes from some research that Robert and I did into work that folks have done to gain community acceptance for affordable housing across the country. And we'll also hear from Nevada and Nicole about some of the work that they've done and what they've learned about what works to build support for affordable housing in their communities. We will answer your questions, and we will also provide you with a way to continue the discussion after the webinar is over. I'd like to thank Capital One for making webinars like this possible. Any opinions or errors, however, are ours alone. So let's cover some of our most frequently asked questions. First of all, is this being recorded? Yes, we are recording this webinar. An archived copy of this webinar will be available afterwards. We'll send a link to everyone who registered once the recording is online. Second, please note that all participant lines are muted so that everyone has clear sound quality. But we will be taking your questions. If you have a question for us at any time during the webinar, you can submit it through the question box in the GoToWebinar control panel. And you see we have a picture here of what that looks like. It's the box towards the bottom that has the arrows pointing to it in this picture. We'll answer as many of your questions as possible at the end of the webinar. Again, there will be a way for you to go online and continue the discussion if we're not able to get to your question. Finally, we want to address technical difficulties. While we hope the webinar runs smoothly for everyone, we all know that this doesn't always happen. If you run into any technical difficulties during the webinar, please use the Help menu at the top of the GoToWebinar control panel, right up here. You can locate technical support there. And if that doesn't work, you can visit the GoToWebinar support website, which is support.citrixonline.com, and you can get help there. So with that, I will turn it over to Robert, who's going to tell you about our research into best practices in gaining community acceptance.
Thank you, Amy. So back in 2013, we here at the Center for Housing Policy and NHC had an opportunity to profile an array of successful efforts that are building supportive housing for formerly homeless individuals in the face of community opposition or concerns. And the goal of our research was to understand the context of concerns and patterns among successful strategies for building community acceptance. So Amy and I interviewed affordable housing developers in 10 case study locations, and in some cases also interviewed some city staff that could help illuminate some of these successful patterns. In each jurisdiction, we focused on successful efforts to create housing for formerly homeless individuals and families, but the approaches from the 10 case studies we did really are broadly applicable and relevant to a wide range of affordable housing properties. So here are the case studies we looked at. We tried to have geographic diversity, and we're able to speak with and learn about projects created by these lead partners that you see here from Arlington, Chicago, Montgomery County, Maryland, New York City, Nevada, California, Philadelphia, Portland, San Francisco, Seattle, and Sunnyvale, California in Silicon Valley. First, I want to review some of the issues for opposition that came up in the research. These will sound very familiar. The property will be managed poorly, leading to crime and depressed property values. It will discourage higher-end development in the community. It will overload the schools and other services. the design is no good. It's too big. It's too massive. It'll change the character as a result and cast shadows on nearby properties, or mostly just depress home values. But yeah, and certainly there are other concerns that come up, such as traffic, I know, consistently. Not so much in this case, since we were looking really at supportive housing developments. But what we learned what we were able to identify were 8 reoccurring traits of successful approaches to winning community support and getting properties built. So Amy and I are going to briefly touch on these before turning the floor over to Nevada Merriman from Midpenn Housing and Nicole Macris from Delridge Housing in Seattle. In fact, Amy, if you want to take this first one, this was one of the most, I think, important principles that we started to learn about.
Sure. Thanks, Robert. So when Robert and I took a look at the registration for this webinar, we were really happy to see that so many folks who work in state and local government were interested, because cities in particular have a really important role to play in creating a structure that's going to support productive conversations and decision making. So, the way we develop affordable homes in the United States is really through having public and, I guess, quasi-governmental entities really carrying out the affordable housing goals and the policy priorities that the community has set. And so while it's not often the city or the locality itself that's out in front in these processes, the city is the one that has the ability to set standards and create a framework for the conversation. So putting into place the kinds of goals and kind of affirming the interest in creating this kind of housing in communities around the city or around the county is really important. We found in our research, for example, the City of Seattle in its consolidated plan has requirements around community engagement itself. The plan clearly states that the purpose is to facilitate understanding, and that the city isn't going to turn away funding for a development just because of community opposition. And in that section of the comprehensive plan, there's specific mention of the protected classes who can't be discriminated against in this situation. And so, I personally lived in Seattle for 10 years, and doing this research was the first time I ever cracked open the city's comprehensive plan. So no, this isn't something that, the average person day to day is going to be looking at, but it's one of the ways to sort of set a standard and have something in place that that everyone can reference. It's also important for the cities to provide guidelines and standards for how community engagement processes need to go, so that the nonprofits and others who are out front much of the time are able to show neighbors and others who are concerned and interested in the development that they're following the process that they're supposed to. We also saw examples of cities, I think particularly Seattle, having some statements about the role of the community members themselves. Things like, the community members should listen and should be there to learn and that kind of thing. So creating a framework is really a big role for cities.
Indeed. The second reoccurring trait of successful approaches was that project sponsors also created a productive, respectful space for conversations with stakeholders. And this was, really the, through one-on-one conversations, one-on-one meetings, to a lesser extent, small group discussions that this happened. We'll hear a little bit about also the open house format and how to break up a large town meeting. But it really helped to engage with people individually. So I'm thinking about Mary Kay Sweeney, for example, the executive director of Homeward Bound, who you said, never underestimate the value of a cup of tea or coffee. She, in leading the development of Oma Village in Novato, California, which was a somewhat smaller rental community for formerly homeless families, really relied heavily on this. Many other successful developments also did as well, especially early in the outreach process. So they favored these kinds of meetings to large town hall and open mic formats that can encourage grandstanding. And they also, I want to point out, were, and many of these approaches I want to point out are no doubt familiar to many of you on the call. But city staff played a key role in a couple of cities that we studied in identifying the key people that a developer would want to include in outreach when the neighborhood itself was relatively new and the project was just starting to take life. Individual meetings were also really helpful for eliminating what one interviewee termed fear-based histrionics, and also for negotiating the details of community support. Going back to Novato and this Homeward Bound development, Oma Village, these kinds of meetings were helpful in identifying what really mattered most to people with concerns and skepticism, and really ultimately leading to a final approval process where many would-be opponents no longer felt the need to attend the actual city council meeting. A third common trait of these 10 case studies was a transparent process. Transparency really, once the review of the project is live. So in some cases, the developer, but especially the locality, were clear about what the process was, how it would unfold, how decisions would be made, where things stood in the process. And this seemed to happen or help really in instances to assure communities that a decision hadn't already been made. Amy had once said, and I want to quote her, which is that nothing cues a community to sharpen their pitchforks or escalate the urgency of their attacks like the sense that they're being locked out of the process. And this was a way to kind of preemptively deal with that. Number 4, connecting stakeholders to authorities that are able to directly answer their questions or concerns. Amy, why don't you elaborate on this if you would?
Sure. So it strikes me that when a new development, affordable development, is being proposed for a community, is probably the maybe first or sometimes only time that a lot of members of a community become active in any kind of public process and are in the same room with a government official or someone else who seems to have some power or influence, who can listen to them. And so I think there's a lot going on here. So the majority of us aren't necessarily sure how these processes work, who you go to, right, when you want, say, a park to be built in your community. And so sometimes you see folks trying to get those concerns addressed as a part of the process of approving and developing an affordable housing. And you also, you see folks who are bringing a wide range of concerns, from public safety to stress on schools to transportation. And so it's not necessarily the sponsor of the development who's the best person to answer the questions that a lot of neighbors might have. And this is also an opportunity for a wide range of folks in government and in other parts of the community to make themselves available. So, it's helpful to have neighbors from previous developments that the sponsor has been involved in come talk about what the development is like in their community and the experience they had. Bring in the police chief to talk about crime and answer those questions. And if people are bringing other sort of unrelated concerns or things that can't really be addressed in this process, or that really aren't a part of providing affordable housing to people in the community who need it, at the very least, local government folks can make clear that they're listening to those concerns and provide another way for those concerns to be addressed. And I think, Robert, you had a good example from New York of this kind of thing.
Indeed. Yeah, when SUS, Serving the Underserved, was building Make-em residences in the Bronx, it was great help to connect the neighborhood council where this proposed development was going to happen with members of the neighborhood council who were involved and saw previous development of SUS. And so by linking basically peers to neighbors of this previous project, they were able to facilitate a very honest conversation that was much more persuasive in the end in winning support from the local neighborhood in the Bronx than anything that SUS could have said themselves in public meetings. They got to talk to neighbors who now already had lived with for many years a really successful development, much like what was being proposed in the Bronx. Just to run through some other principles, our fifth, common theme was that stakeholders went on tours of other affordable housing communities built by the sponsor. This is, a long-term best practice that many developers and communities have found helpful. Really, it brings to life often the long-term track record of the particular developer. And people talked about how it also brought to life what contemporary affordable housing looks like. And also the kinds of people who would live in the proposed development. If a meeting can be held at a property itself or in that community room, you can kill two birds with one stone, as a couple of our interviewers talked about, interviewees, I should say. The process of engaging stakeholders early enabled some of the sponsors to modify their proposal early enough that it could be done more cost effectively. There are certain fiscal realities and feasibility issues that may impede completely developing what a community first envisions they want. But it enabled, for example, in Novato for the scale to be slightly modified with respect to certain property lines. In Philadelphia, it led to the inclusion of retail on a ground floor of a commercial corridor that actually worked financially for the developer, Project Home. In Portland, it had to do with issues of appearance and modifying these later. The number 7 trait that I heard commonly was it was very helpful to clarify what happens after the property is built and lease up happens. What are going to be the ongoing channels of communication if and when issues arrive post-construction? Who is the long-term manager and operator of the property, and how are they contacted? And what resources will be in place to operate the property responsibly over the long term? Finally, number 8, in some cases, particularly here in the DC metropolitan area in Arlington and Montgomery County, supportive housing was integrated into larger 100% affordable housing developments, and that was identified as their most effective strategy for building community support. Like I said, literally made the supportive housing component a non-issue because it was part of a larger, otherwise branded property. So it's less of a communication strategy here, but this was a theme that did come up in a couple case studies that was part of our research. So I should turn this back over to you, Amy, and our kind of panelists of honor who are going to be able to get into greater detail about a specific story in their community.
Sure. Well, Robert, if you go to the next slide, I have a couple of messaging
oh, yeah, sorry.
recommendations. Yeah, no
Let's do that first.
So I'll just go through these really briefly, and these are not from this research specifically, but these are just some general points that I think help us communicate better. So first of all, it's important that we really work to understand community concerns from the point of view of the community member. It's not unreasonable to be concerned about your property value when we in the United States put so much of our money into our homes. it's not unreasonable to be concerned about public safety, right? That's something that everyone wants to live in a safe community. Those concerns aren't unreasonable. It's the misinformation that might be driving those concerns, or the fear that might be driving those concerns. So even in these sort of sometimes wrong-headed, right, community concerns, there's a value that we can latch onto that will help us communicate with people. So use those core values and connect. We need to connect our work to them. So I understand that you're concerned about public safety. I'm concerned about public safety too, and that's why I think it's so important that we make sure that these affordable homes are available to people in our community. That's one of the ways that you can leverage the concerns that people express. One thing that we've seen be very effective is to frame housing or affordable homes generally as a consumer issue and not a social issue. We often view housing as being a social issue, right? It's a way of solving. Affordable homes are something that solve other problems in our community. But for most people, we interact with homes, with our housing on the market. We pay our mortgage, we pay our rent. It's a transaction. And so using words and using frameworks, so the market is failing lower income people in our community, and that's why we need this new housing development. That's a way to tap into the things that people already think about housing and frame the conversation more effectively. Robert talked about this a little bit, and I know that Nevada and Nicole are going to get into this as well from different points of view, but telling a story and choosing the right messengers to tell that story is so important. One of the things that seems to be the most effective to convince people that it's okay to have a development, an affordable development in their communities is by having it be there and be successful. And you obviously, if you don't have, you need to be able to bring that track record in some way. And so having people come and tell the story of a development being successful in their community and it being a good neighbor to them is really effective. It can also be useful to pull in the other individuals or services or systems that are part of making the whole thing work. So, a neighborhood watch captain who can talk about how things went okay when your last development came online in the community next door. Have a business owner come in and talk about how great it is to have these new neighbors because they shop in the community now. Telling that sort of story about the community, bringing in the right messengers from the community can help people see that this is more than just something that's going to have an impact or bring concern, but that it's something that really can be a positive part of the community. So we'll give you our contact information again later, but now I will turn it over to Nevada Merriman, who will tell you about her work in California.
Hello, I'm Nevada Merriman. I'm with Mid-Penn Housing. Just to briefly introduce the organization, we work in 10 Northern California counties, and we are just a little over 40 years old. We were founded through a collaboration through Stanford University because they were worried about the high cost of housing on the San Francisco Peninsula. And we see that their wisdom has endured in its relevance as Silicon Valley has only continued to have significant challenges in affordable housing. That's me. I'm Nevada Merriman, Senior Project Manager, and I've been on the team for 7 years. I've organized many site visits for city staff and elected officials, and I mostly work on complex permitting, entitlements, and community engagement for several of Mid-Penn's high-profile projects. The Sunnyvale Armory site was particularly challenging because you see it from one perspective here, but the project was 117 units total, and it was actually 2 projects that were being put forth by 2 separate sponsors. So Mid-Penn Housing was developing the rendering that you see here. And then right adjacent to it is another project by Charities Housing. They are also a very reputable organization with a deep track record. The project is 117 units, as I mentioned, and the Mid-Penn project is 58 family units, and the Charities Housing is 59 studios. Now, combined in both of those, 47 of these apartments are permanent supportive housing for chronically homeless populations. So we were concerned about bringing this project that's relatively large to a neighborhood in transition, both for design reasons, but also because we knew we would have to overcome some perceptions about the population we were serving. So our response to structuring this was to really gather our stakeholders. And these are just a few of the folks that we reached out to. The city of Sunnyvale was obviously a key player for us. The Downtown Streets team is a group that does a lot of on-the-street interaction with homeless folks. And they ended up really being one of the key voices that won over the city council. We were also proactive in our engagement of the county, the school districts, and SNAIL is just one of the neighborhood associations. There are many, many in Sunnyvale, but we reached out to anyone who would listen. I want to take just 1 minute and discuss the role of the city here because it was really fundamental to our success. The primary thing that the city did, and just bear with me, is they established a website specifically for this project. And what I really liked about this is that it was a key place for the media to look to see what else was happening. It established a timeline where we were in the project. And it also really publicly showed that for over a year, Mid-Penn and Charities Housing were engaged in meeting with folks basically wherever anybody wanted us to meet with them. So we had several public open house, bigger forums. We also met with countless folks in coffee shops. And this website really helped to set the context. And what I appreciated about it is that the city was able to find a place, a position that they were comfortable taking, which is really just helping increase the transparency of the process. But they set a context to record our history and time and really show that that we were making a good faith effort to engage in the community. So I was appreciative for that, and as you can see, there's just a lot of background information and links that we thought were really important to be able to share on this public forum. So moving back to the PowerPoint. The other key stakeholder was really the school district, and I'll talk about that more later. Now, I would be remiss if I didn't discuss the involvement of advocates here on the San Francisco Peninsula area. Mid-Penn tries to maintain relationships year-round so that we can really call upon these folks, and we have something that is a challenge to us. And I can't overstate the importance of the advocates that we have. Not only do they bring logistical know-how and definitely manpower when we're trying to host a complicated event, but they lend credibility, and they can also help message and define our goals. It's really key to find out where your grounding point is in all of this while you're making your decisions, and so I recommend reaching out to them. On that note, something particularly interesting about the San Francisco area is that the NPH, this organization here, Nonprofit Housing Association of Northern California, they have online many tools for advocates that I think are top-notch, and I use some of these tools pretty much to the letter. These toolkits, I've made these links available to the organizers of this event, but especially related to overcoming community opposition and bus tours, how to engage with the media. It's really endless resources here if you're interested in engaging with that, and it's certainly easier than reinventing the wheel. So this is a recommendation for me to rely upon the tools these advocates have put together. So there we go. And I encourage everybody to look at that and see if there's something that can help them with their work. In terms of our grounding point and where our advocates really helped us come from is we knew we wanted a really collaborative experience, and so we tried to host as many events as possible. We also were worried because in a bigger setting, sometimes we noticed that particular residents or neighborhood influencers are able to control the conversation, and it can sometimes hinder us being able to really get at some of the other concerns that might be in the room. And so we tried very carefully to figure out how we could possibly speak to so many different groups of people all within the same meeting. And what we came up with is that we would structure this meeting, and instead of having a public comment, much like what I'm showing here, we would really do a presentation all together as a group, and then we would break off into smaller groups so that people could go to the various stations to discuss whatever topic was really on their mind. And there were a lot of different topics here. So in order to kind of run through how we did this, I need to show you a PowerPoint within a PowerPoint, but let's take a look. So our open house, this was our second open house. Our first was a presentation of the developers themselves there and our commitment to engage with the community in the process. A year later, we were ready to present the design. And the agenda is important to me to discuss only in that the first few steps, 1 through 6, were all done in a very traditional format of a presenter talking to a single group of people. But at item 7, we dispersed to try to really air more of the community concerns. And it was a large project with a cast of thousands, and so we spent a lot of time introducing everybody who was there, our developer teams, the architect teams, many people from the city, the county, other homeless services providers, and the superintendent of schools. And so we made sure that when it was time to ask questions, that we connected somebody directly to whoever could really speak to that issue. And what was important about that is that it became less of a sales pitch of how Mid-Penn or Charities is able to bring the project together, and more obviously showed that this is really a team effort. I want to take a moment to say that no presentation of this would be complete without talking about how we are already working in the Sunnyvale community. We already have a large wait list, over 2,000 individuals who are interested in moving into our communities, and that a lot of folks that are our residents are giving back, are employed, have children in the school system, and it really kind of speaks to our overall commitment that it's a long-term relationship. We also take special care to go through our property management programs and our services programs, and had executives from both of those different parts of Mid-Penn organization there to answer questions about how we would operate. I think that's really important to neighbors because the development staff is often not really best equipped to talk about how issues that may come up in the field will be resolved. So on to responding to community feedback. Two of the issues that are pretty typical, one neighborhood compatibility, and that's really about design, and then the other was the school district. So we worked with our architects to come up with an approach to couching the design so that it was obvious that we really care about good design and that we think it matters. And part of doing that, unfortunately, is addressing the failures of our industry in the past. I cannot tell you how many public officials have whispered to me after that this is the image that they're afraid of when we talk about affordable housing. So we still have a long way to go to show that we've learned lessons and that we really are committed to high-quality design. The issues of neighborhood compatibility, I know many folks on this call have their own challenges and deep experience with this. However, the part that's important here is that the city had specific opinions. Our planner was worried about the project and its massing from specific angles. They really encouraged us to just take this head on, to show it as best as possible, nestled into the community, and to really take the time to then walk residents through how it would look and hear the concerns and see if there's any modifications that needed to be made. related to that was our impact on the shading of nearby projects. Again, with our massing and building heights, this relates to issues of privacy that many homeowners are rightfully concerned about. But we really followed the city's lead and showed angles we might not have shown otherwise in efforts to air concerns and to make sure that the community really knew what it might look like. In terms of the school district, I did not do this part of the presentation at all. We turned it over to Dr. Benjamin Picard. Meeting with him about 6 months prior to this meeting was really key to being able to address that our schools in this neighborhood are not over capacity, they're quite high performing, and that this particular district we're in actually has the most resources for lower income and English as a second language type students. And so the superintendent's recommendation was that this was a great place for future residents to be, and that it was going to continue to be a collaborative effort. So I owe a debt of gratitude to Dr. Picard for his involvement in this and his commitment. To speak to that just a little more, he sees a lot of children whose families are struggling with homelessness, and the school is really stretched to be able to provide services to support a family that is in crisis in this way. And with the way that rents are in the Sunnyvale area, he knows of several families that are living in garages or have been split up, and that it obviously is a huge impediment to a child learning. Okay, on to next steps. The city's website set this up for us, and we reinforced it every chance we could of what are the opportunities to connect with us and where were the key decision-making meetings, when they were going to happen. We just wanted to make sure that we were completely transparent about this. And then this was our last slide in the open house, and it served to disperse folks to the areas where they were most concerned. Certainly people were worried about the high number of chronically homeless folks, and so we wanted to make sure that our services plan and the other folks in the city and county that are deeply engaged with homelessness were going to answer the questions about that. We also had many folks from the city at their own booth, and then at every single table we had a member of the development team. We, in addition to answering questions, we carefully recorded all the questions. We responded to every concern that was brought up, and then we made the record of that public on the city's website and distributed it widely. So one thing we also did in Sunnyvale was we offered a bus tour, and it's something that I love to do, and I've hosted many of them with Mid-Penn and our other advocates. This one in particular is from Menlo Park, because the city of Sunnyvale, we did it, I guess, enough outreach that nobody took us up on it in this particular city. However, we've done them in the past, and I think they're a wonderful way to get people out and into our properties so that they can experience what it's like to be a resident at a Mid-Penn housing community. I think that we've gained a lot of support that way, and most importantly, we can not only take the project off the page of what a simple summary might show and really allow people to feel it in their bones, that we create safe communities, that our communities are places that our residents love to live in, that they have friends there, that they're warm, welcoming places where people can really focus on other aspects of their lives. The other thing that if you're able to pull into your work in community organizing is connecting with our residents. This is Carmen Arnada, and her story is very powerful. She's become a great speaker for Mid-Penn, but she was facing homelessness after her husband lost his job, and to the extent that we can make the connection that often doesn't happen, it also really places our work in a completely different framework in the rest of the community. And I'm not sure if we have a moment to show a quick video. Organizers, what do you think?
Well, my concern, it just occurred to me that I'm not sure if the audio is going to work the way it needs to. So if you can send me a link to the video, because I want folks to be able to see it, then I'll send that out.
Okay, very good. Okay, we'll continue. So Carmen, she lives in Peninsula Station, but I've provided these materials to the organizer. I think that her personal story does a much better job than just looking at the development itself. And so with that, an underscore of whenever we can bring storytelling and also bring other members of the community into our properties and vice versa, I think that we establish a really great ground to be able to continue to do our work and to engage the community and show folks everything that bringing safe, decent, affordable housing can do for a neighborhood. So thank you very much. I am happy to take your questions.
Thank you, Nevada. So I'm going to turn it over to Nicole now, and I want to remind all of you that if you have questions, you can type them into the question box. I see we have a couple already, but please do ask us your questions.
Okay. Thanks, Amy, and thanks, Nevada. That was great, and it's great to hear so many themes in both your presentations that really echo for the work that we did. I'm going to talk about a particular development that actually just recently opened. But a little bit of background, DESC is located in Seattle, Washington, and it exists to end the homelessness of vulnerable people. We're a large multi-service center serving the needs of high-needs, behaviorally disabled homeless individuals, and we provide emergency shelter, licensed mental health and chemical dependency treatment, and we operate about 1,000 units of permanent supportive housing, both in scattered site and single site arrangements throughout the city of Seattle. We take exclusively a housing first approach, and for us at DESC, when we think of housing first, we think of the image here that actually our deputy director's daughter drew when we opened one of our projects in the early 2000s. Welcome home, stay as long as you want, which was a novel concept at the time when we started doing Housing First. Housing First, I think, has some unique attributes that raise concerns for community members who are less familiar with it. So while we think of this lovely image of eating cookies and drinking hot cocoa, neighbors tend to focus on particular aspects of Housing First that seem counterintuitive to them. In particular, they usually are concerned about, or they misconceive, eligibility and the fact that services are not required. So I hear from a lot of neighbors, well, it sounds like you let anybody in and you don't require them to do anything, and how am I supposed to feel safe in my neighborhood when that's your operating model? And so we spend a lot of time educating people about our service approach and how our buildings operate and how we engage with residents once they move in. I'm going to talk a bit about our experience with the Cottage Grove Commons, which just opened a few months ago. It's in the West Seattle neighborhood of Seattle, which is, as Nevada described in her experience, a neighborhood that the neighbors themselves described as one in transition. There is a history of crime and poverty in the neighborhood. In recent years, there's been some gentrification and some economic development, but it certainly is a neighborhood that still struggles, particularly with infrastructure needs, alleyways. Are not paved, for instance. Sidewalks are inconsistent throughout the neighborhood, and it's in a valley, and it rains pretty much every day here in Seattle, and so there's a lot of drainage issues. So that presented some unique concerns that the neighbors had, in addition to the ones that Robert and Amy talked about. So the Cottage Grove Commons is permanent supportive housing. It includes a retail space on the first floor, and I'll talk a little bit about that later, and it's 66 studio apartments. So there are some tenets that we follow that we've learned over time around community engagement, and we do it every time we prepare to do a new development. The first one is hope for the best, prepare for the worst. DESC has been developing permanent supportive housing for a little over 20 years, and in that time we have opened 10 buildings. I have been involved in 7 of those developments, and I would say 3 of them we had significant community concern raised and engaged in a pretty robust community engagement process. But regardless, our strategy is consistent with every single development. We don't know what to expect until we begin, and so we sort of prepare. The next tenet that we really follow is this one of weather the storm, that the most important attribute that we find in doing community engagement, particularly when we're facing a lot of opposition, is just to persevere. The thing that really gets us through is sort of sticking with our messaging and continuing to engage with neighbors even when we're sort of feeling like we're in the depths of it not ever turning around to something good. And we really keep our mind focused on the fact that community support is a long-term goal. So when we set out to do our work, we are not necessarily looking for community support before we break ground or even before we open the doors to the building. We see it as really a long-term goal. We are working towards community support, particularly knowing that we're bringing highly vulnerable people in to live in a neighborhood, and we want to make sure that they feel supported and welcomed and not ostracized by their neighbors. But we know that one of the main attributes in building community support is trust, and trust really comes from having a good reputation and from having real authentic relationships with neighbors, and that's difficult to do early on in a development process. And where those relationships really get formed is once we open our buildings and folks get to see how we operate our buildings, they get to know our staff, and they get to know the residents living in the buildings. So this is sort of at a high level, we think about our community engagement in stages before we select a site, before we announce it, and then during our development and after development. After development being the most important piece because that's when we're there and we're going to be there for a very long time. And we have come up with a plan that sort of makes sure that we kind of walk ourselves through all of the steps. And most of these steps we actually do prior to speaking with any neighbors. We do a lot of mapping of the environment, a lot of the stuff that Nevada was saying about who are your friends, who are the influencers, what do key government officials, elected officials think about what you're going to do. And then we assess our risk tolerance to see, where are we going to make trade-offs? We're pretty tied to, our mission is very tied to a specific population of high needs people, and we are really tied to a particular philosophical approach in how we deliver our services. But where are we willing to compromise in the size of the building, in the retail tenant, in how we engage with neighbors? I mean, in the timing of our development, we really push ourselves in thinking about where we are willing to compromise and what our tolerance for risk is, and not just financial risk, but risk to our reputation and risk to other affordable housing provider reputations and how we handle our community engagement. So one of the main features for us is that community engagement becomes an integral part of our development. So everyone on the development team is in sync about our community engagement strategy. An example of that in our Cottage Grove Commons development is that our general contractor was very aware of how we were working to engage neighbors, and they created a monthly update on construction that they provided, that they left with neighbors, dropped off at their doors in the immediate neighborhood with contact information for both key leaders at DESC, but also for on-site construction managers. So neighbors could at any time feel like they could contact someone if they had questions about the development. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the things touching on the points that Robert said of what works well, and then a little bit about what doesn't work so well. So to echo some of the things that Nevada said, certainly showing people other projects that we have developed, ones that have been operating for a long time, ones that are newer, referring them to others in the community who either run businesses or live close by other buildings that we operate. All of those things are key. This photo here, I picked it specifically because it looks sort of chaotic, but it is a few days before we started renting units. We had a number of community members who had collected move-in supplies for residents and got them set up in their apartments, and it was a wonderful way to get folks into the building and to get them invested in the success of our residents. And I picked this photo in particular because it does look chaotic, but this is what works well when you just get people in there and doing the work with you. Creating volunteer opportunities is a great way to build community support. I would say overarching, what really works well is transparency and information sharing. So similar to what Nevada was saying, I'm going to switch here to a web page. We created a web page that had multiple links to share information, including a very extensive frequently asked questions that really got at very detailed level questions that neighbors had about the project. Another thing we did in the Cottage Grove process is to form a neighborhood advisory committee, and that committee was ongoing for over a year, and these are all the minutes from those meetings. And so to share a great deal of information is always helpful. And I'm going to talk a little bit, when I talk about what doesn't work, how we got to do it, a neighborhood advisory committee. Some other great things to do are to host open houses. When we opened this building, we hosted a specific open house that was marketed to neighbors to provide an opportunity for them to come in. In other buildings we have operated for longer, we continue with the neighborhood engagement by providing opportunities for neighbors to come in the building. So we've done anniversary events, open houses when we're open for 1 or 2 years, just to serve coffee and cookies and invite neighbors to come and chat with staff and residents. We have also opened up our community rooms for other community events. So if there are neighborhood events like parades, in one neighborhood we open up our community room for refreshments after a neighborhood parade in the summer. And that's just a way to bring people into the building. And that is what really helps to build our reputation. So I want to focus on the after the development piece of the work, because what really builds community trust is when people know how to get in touch with you and they feel like you're responsive to their concerns. And so we do a lot of training when we open new buildings with the staff on the ground. In these Housing First buildings we have 24-hour staff available, and we train them on our expectations around engaging with neighbors, responding to neighbors' concerns, and integrating into the life of the neighborhood, finding ways for residents in the building to get involved in community activities, but also for staff. For instance, our managers of all of our buildings participate in the relevant neighborhood associations so they can share info about what's happening in the buildings, but also so they can become more connected with the neighborhood on what is of concern and interest to the broader neighborhood. So I always tell staff that while I am often the community relations contact person at DESC, that they are really the community relations ambassadors and how they do their work every single day. So I'm going to go back to our PowerPoint here. So what doesn't work well? I chose the picture in this slide because it looks very lovely and organized, and it's a picture of a big community forum that we had. And while we organized it much in the way that Nevada described, where we had key experts who joined the meeting and presented to neighbors, including high-level officials from the City Office of Housing and Development and Planning, the police commander from the local precinct, the Director of Economic Development, the County Mental Health Director, our architects. What we found is in such a large forum, and we also broke out into groups. If you'll see here, this was a bit of an open space style meeting with there's markers and butcher paper for people to capture their concerns. In the end, often key influencers or significant opposers can really hijack a meeting like this. And so we really found that creating an advisory committee that was representative of neighbors' interests and working with community stakeholders to figure out what representation looks like in terms of who are the key stakeholders to participate was really key. And I'll comment on just one other aspect that I don't think really works well, which is good neighbor agreements. I have participated in a few different good neighbor agreement negotiation processes, and I have found that that often elected officials have asked that we engage in that process out of good intention, and there are sometimes reasons to engage in good neighbor agreements. But I find some of the challenges with doing that is that just the name itself implies that the housing operator would otherwise not be a good neighbor and would be a bad neighbor, which sets up a challenging dynamic. And as you go through discussions in good neighbor agreements, what often happens is you quickly get to questions of who has authority and who is accountable, and neighbors often want more authority than the structure will allow. So the non-profit housing provider is accountable to funders and other entities, and neighbors are often trying to figure out how they can insert themselves into that sort of scope of authority, and it's difficult to do that. They'll often make requests such as, we want the government to shut down this project if we recommend that it's not working the way we want it to. And that's just not feasible in how these programs operate. The other challenge that we have found is because there's an inequity in sort of the organizational structure where the housing provider, a private nonprofit, has a clear sort of line of authority and accountability. Often neighborhood groups don't have that. They tend to be a bit more nebulous, and so you can go through a whole negotiation process where you're essentially committing to do the things you otherwise would be likely to do without a good neighbor agreement, and in the end there's really no incentive for the neighbors to sign on to the agreement, and so it really turns out to be a commitment you make, and in the end what I have seen happen more than once is neighbors say, well, that's not good enough, we're not agreeing to this, we're walking away from the table. And so you really, in a good neighbor agreement, often don't get a lot of community relations or political gain in doing it. And almost always it ends in an ongoing advisory committee. And so my preference is really to do the work to instead establish an ongoing advisory committee. I want to say a couple of comments, and I think I'm probably then running over time here, is just it's important to be clear in when you're being transparent about why you're engaging with neighbors, because people do get frustrated about, you know, why are you even coming to us? You're already planning to do this. Why do you care what we think? Is to be really clear about why you want to hear from neighbors. And often that is to hear their concerns about the impacts on the neighborhood, to hear their thoughts about an input on design of the building. We often make our commercial spaces available to neighbors, meaning that we want to hear from neighbors what kind of retail establishments they want, and we're definitely willing to provide very affordable rents so that we can have community-based organizations occupying our retail. And then often what the project should be named, and do neighbors have an opinion about that. So we try to be very clear about the things that we're interested in hearing from neighbors. And while we're very glad to educate neighbors about our program and the attributes of our residents, we're less interested in hearing from them their opinions about how we should operate our services in the building. And we try to be very clear about that so there's not any confusion. I have, in addition to the FAQs that I showed you and the advisory committee stuff, I have a number of things on the website, including operating agreements that operating documents that we use, such as a good neighbor commitment that we include in our lease, a letter that we use to canvass and engage neighbors on providing a 24-hour number that they can contact us with, and I can provide that. Or if you just go to our website, desc.org, you can find that information. So that's my story on there. Sorry for running over.
Oh, thank you, Nicole, so much. As I'm sure you all have noted, we're at 5 minutes after the hour, but I also see that the majority of our webinar attendees are still on the line and paying attention. So Nicole and Nevada, thank you very much for your presentations. I want to very briefly, and if the two of you are able to stay for a couple of minutes over time, that would be great. We just have a couple of questions right now. But I want to show you a place where I hope many of you will be interested in going after this webinar to continue the conversation. The National Housing Conference hosts the Housing Communications Hub. It's an online community that is available for you to ask your questions and talk with one another about how we do our communications work better. So I strongly encourage you to visit hub.nhc.org, particularly to share your own thoughts about how to build community acceptance of affordable and supportive housing. Let us know what's worked well for you. Ask each other questions about how to do this work. So please go ahead and visit there. Here's some contact information for you, and I will I'll bring up the questions. So first we have a note from Cynthia at the Supportive Housing Network of New York, reminding us that they have a fantastic community support building toolkit, and we will make sure that that is made available on the hub or elsewhere. It's a really great tool for anyone to use. We have a question from Bob, and I think Nevada or Nicole, you may have an answer to this. Bob says, these projects seem to develop and operate. Do you feel that the same methods that we've talked about work if the developer will turn the project over to a user? For example, the operator may not be known when the project is going through the approval process. He says he's thinking more about something like a group home situation rather than a big development. Do either of you have thoughts about that?
I don't, only because I haven't worked in that context where the operator is different than the developer.
So Midpen Housing occasionally will act as a turnkey developer for a particular project. However, even in that scenario, we always know who is going to be ultimately operating the building, and we tend to have them at the table and coming alongside with us for all of the engagement. So I also don't have a direct experience with turning it over to an entirely unknown group. However, we've developed for a smaller senior housing provider, Leslie Foundation. We've also owned and developed and provided technical assistance for homeless organizations that have less development capacity and sometimes less access to capital. So I think it can be done and just requires more, at least using the tools that we've described today.
Okay. Robert, was there anything specific from our research that comes to mind in this instance?
No, nothing to add.
Okay. All right. If any of you have questions, and I know there's still a bunch of folks on the webinar, please do type them in now. We would love to get to them. And as I mentioned at the beginning, we will be sending out the recording of this webinar as well as slides and links to other resources that we've talked about. And all of these resources are going to be shared on the Housing Communications Hub, which I mentioned. So you'll get a link to go there as well. But that's a great place to look for other sort of community support or community acceptance building resources, including we've shared a lot of what Nevada was pointing to from the nonprofit Housing Association of Northern California, their toolkit. So that's there as well. Okay. All right. Selena says, it looks like she may be, you may still be typing, Selena, I'm not sure. That's okay, you're typing fast enough. So Selena says, I guess one thing that I see is sort of two different narratives. One is being a part of the community and finding compatibility, being very collaborative, and then the other is still sort of adversarial. Any comment on that?
I'll talk a little bit about that. So one of the challenges in doing permanent supportive housing in particular is that it's challenging to get neighbors to understand the role that their specific neighborhood communities play in addressing homelessness. While that is why it's really important to get other folks involved, including government officials and other key stakeholders, so folks sort of understand the bigger role that they have to play in that. But that is mostly background education around policy to provide to neighbors. It often comes up in the context of a development process. More often, it's important to just try and keep the conversation focused on what the community concerns are and also what their interests are. And so it's not necessarily adversarial, but it's really sort of focused on sort of this during the development process, this is the scope of the engagement. It's not around whether or not we'll build the project or what kind of people we'll have in the project or what kind of housing model, but how can the project really be integrated into the neighborhood in a way that supports neighborhood goals.
Thank you. So Gina asks if there are any suggestions for changing the conversation within your city government. Nevada, do you have any thoughts about that?
Well, I think one of the key things that can help change the conversation is to make sure that our residents aren't somehow an unknown or foreign group of population to the people who are supposed to be representing them. We find that as many times as we can invite them to other events that are in the community where they can interact with our residents and kind of make the connection that these people are brothers and sisters and neighbors, that really can help. It's a little bit, my other part to that answer is very specific to Silicon Valley. However, across the country, I think people can think critically about what your own systematic and challenging issues are. In Silicon Valley, we can move beyond just speaking about access to housing as a moral issue. I believe it is, but beyond that, I think it also, for us, really constrains our economic growth, because a lot of our jobs that are produced, only about a third of them are the high-tech jobs that you hear about in the newspaper. About two-thirds of them are very middle-class or very working-class job positions open, and there's really no housing for these folks. So to the extent that you can start to frame it in such a way that that the people you're talking to, something that strikes home with them, and most of the elected officials around here, they care about constraints to economic growth and what's going to ultimately not allow the rising tide that we're currently experiencing to keep happening forever. And that's certainly the supply of affordable housing here. So,
thank you for that. Gosh, I'm going to mispronounce this person's name, so I apologize. Susie or Susie asks us, Nicole mentions that the big community forum didn't work in DESC's case, even with the breakout sessions, and she wonders why that is. Was the group too large? Did the room not work for facilitating breakouts? Nicole, what do you think the problem was?
I think the group was too large. In that meeting I referenced, we had, I think, about 110 neighbors attend, maybe more, and it was during one of the report out sessions. Things seemed to go well, and then I think people's patience kind of runs thin towards the end when they don't feel like in that particular forum they're getting all the information they need to feel good about the project, and it's difficult to do because of the diversity of interests and concerns. And so we set up the forum to sort of break out, but also to say we're going to capture all the information that we're hearing today and provide more detailed responses to folks, including building our advisory committee agenda from the concerns that neighbors have. And that timeline was really frustrating for people, and so kind of the loudest people essentially grabbed the microphone and said, come on over here if you want to sign my petition to shut this whole thing down and tell the city they need to find another place. And so I think it was the number of folks and also just that they weren't getting all the information that they wanted in the 2-hour meeting that we had set up.
Okay. And Robert, in the cases that you studied, you also, I believe, saw the big meeting having some drawbacks as well. Is there anything you would add to what Nicole said?
Well, it seemed like the format in Sunnyvale was slightly different than what you're describing with small groups that report back, which Nevada can speak to more in detail. But certainly it was a common theme that that larger community-wide meetings were more tricky, and they didn't always offer the opportunity to to both hear the range of concerns, even from those who were not willing to kind of grandstand or to speak loudest. And they also didn't allow for a two-way conversation as much as smaller group meetings. So in Chicago, for example, which I didn't talk about, in developing Hope Manor, they didn't have a single large community-wide meeting, but they had a lot of smaller meetings, sometimes involving church groups, where they had a lot of people present. It's a lot of work. It's a lot more work, probably. But they had service providers who could speak directly to what the services were going to be like and had been like, for example, and the aldermen who could answer key questions. There's quasi not related to the project itself. Anything you'd add to that, Nevada, about the large group meeting? If you had it go wrong, and it was the open house format.
Well, we certainly had them go wrong in a similar manner to how Nicole was describing, and it's very frustrating the moment that you realize that you've completely lost facilitation of the meeting and that it's now been hijacked in some way. I would only add that I think that because our booths were, people weren't constrained to have to sit at chairs or be at tables, but it was open space, and so people could mill around from booth to booth and kind of like stretch their legs and walk around. I think that helps because it was, in that way, less structured and allowed people to hit all of the booths if they were interested in all of the topics, and so we thought that that was pretty effective.
I'll
also mention that during the overall presentation, we did have a couple people who were frustrated with the format, and they really wanted the ability to kind of, speak loudly and be able to fan the flames of discontent and do all of this. And we had to kind of stand firm on our ground there, and we were really happy that we did because there were definitely people there who were interested in taking it in a very different direction.
Yeah, and just to piggyback on what Robert said, the small group stuff, you think it takes more work, but it actually doesn't, because the fallout from these big meetings blowing up on you creates a lot more work. So the best meetings that we have had are small group meetings in neighbors' homes. We've done that a number of times where groups of friends or even neighbors who don't necessarily know each other very well but who have come together around concerns or questions that they have around our projects, and sending some key staff out in the evening hours to meet in people's homes has really been, I think, the most fruitful discussions we've had with neighbors.
Thank you for that. So Bob asks us, how do you deal with situations where you've had a bad experience at another location at a previous development? How do you minimize that bad impact? Does that sort of trickle into the conversation about a new development?
It certainly can. Many years ago when I first joined, Midpen was involved in leadership transition, and one of the properties I worked on was very much at the edge of our geographic footprint, almost an hour to an hour and a half away from our central location. And the lease-up process did not go as smoothly as it should have gone. It took us a very long time to overcome that and to regain credibility in that particular county. And I would say that we've done that now, but only through a couple things. First off, the president of our organization is an extremely accountable individual, so he went with us to several meetings to help repair things in the moment, and then very much looks at public officials and says, "This is my number. You can call me if there are any problems." And I think that's impressive considering we have 100 properties. So we have a lot of accountability at the management level and a commitment to just stick with it and work it out. And So if a particular community manager isn't working it or isn't getting the job done or doesn't have the most collaborative relationship with the police, we may think about a staffing change or make some tough decisions and just keep and persevere, which is a theme from Nicole's presentation, but persevere and really try to just show a good faith effort there. And I think you have to stick with it till you make it right, otherwise assume that it's going to be really hard to get the next deal.
Thank you. So one more question, and then we'll go ahead and close. Terry asks, and I'm going to paraphrase your question a little bit, with these types of developments, do communities ever have concern about sort of concentrating populations rather than integrating people into the general public? Is that ever a concern that community members have raised?
I'd say that's a common concern. What often happens is our permanent supportive housing developments are on the front end of adding density to neighborhoods. We're often one of the earlier developers that come into neighborhoods, and so what we often hear are concerns about scale, and that gets somewhat conflated with concerns about the resident population. So it kind of goes, wow, that's a big project, and oh my goodness, that's a lot of homeless people or poor people or people with disabilities. I'm not sure our neighborhood can handle that. In the West Seattle instance, we actually heard some contradictory concerns. It was this, we're concerned about so many people with problems, serious challenges in their life moving into our neighborhood because we already have a lot of problems with crime and drug use, and we think these people are going to add to those problems. And then simultaneously people would say, we're concerned that our neighborhood is so dysfunctional with existing crime and problems that it's going to be a detriment to the highly vulnerable residents that you're aiming to serve.
I'd say that Midtown, we also hear that concern quite a bit, but I would really offer that if you can try to unpack the concern, it can help, because I find the most amount of opposition towards the idea of over-concentrating the non-working poor. And many of our residents are in the active workforce, at least on a family property. And so that can help dispel just exactly whoever those kind of people are. To try to add some nuance there can be helpful. We feel most comfortable when we have about 10% of the project as supportive housing, kind of mixed in with the rest of the incomes that we're trying to target. And so that's a very helpful strategy as well in terms of minimizing some of the concerns. In the case of the Sunnyvale Armory project, which you saw today, that was a 50% chronically homeless project, and so it required a different approach altogether. And that was really needing the county mental health care services to really step up, support the project with dedicated case management. And we had to work harder to show that why our management and services plans were going to be adequate to serve that. But even still, it's 47 units out of 117. So even still, the mixing concept is something that we're more comfortable doing.
Great. Thank you for those answers. Thanks to Nevada and to Nicole for joining us today. Robert and I really appreciate your insight and making the time to share it with the folks who've joined us today. Thanks to everyone who's participated in this webinar. So many of you have stuck around until the bitter end, and we appreciate that as well. Thanks finally to Capital One for their financial support of our webinar series. And I hope to see many of you on the Hub continuing the discussion, hub.nhc.org. Tell us what's worked for you in building community support. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.